On average, you'll have to wait 31 days to see an OBGYN. And if you're dealing with an infection or outbreak, you know you need care fast. That's where WISP comes in. Connect with a U.S. licensed provider online and pick up safe, effective treatment at your local pharmacy that same day. Plus, get birth control and more delivered in all 50 states. Take control with comprehensive sexual and reproductive care, all from your phone. WISP. That's hellowisp.com. The waiting room can wait.
Mochi Health is a long-term weight loss solution personalized to fit your unique needs and goals. Meet one-on-one with board-certified obesity doctors and registered dietitians who are on a mission to listen. Eligible patients can access custom-formulated GLP-1 medications at an affordable, set price and get them delivered to their home each month. No insurance required, FSA and HSA accepted. With 24/7 customer service available, Mochi Health is here to partner with you on your journey to a healthier life. Take the free quiz at joinmochi.com and use code AUDIO40 at checkout for $40 off your first month of membership. That's joinmochi.com.
Okay, we're ready.
All right. So we're really excited to start a new podcast with two really interesting gentlemen, and one which is a relative of two of the people who escaped Alcatraz Island. And I don't know anybody who doesn't know what Alcatraz is, and I don't know anybody who doesn't know about the famous escape from Alcatraz. There's been a lot of lore. There's been a lot of myths about whether or not they actually made it. There's been a movie that Clint Eastwood made that, used some of the elements, but wasn't completely accurate of what was going on. But it was an entertaining movie to kind of show if, in fact, someone could escape from Alcatraz Island. There's been a few documentaries about it. But on this podcast, we're going to hear it from the horse's mouth, or a relative from the horse's mouth. And we have Ken Widener and Mike Lynch. Ken is the nephew, correct, of the two gentlemen that
that's correct.
Right? Okay. And Mike Lynch is his co-author of the book that's coming out in May. So it's going to be available this May. And so during the run-up to the promotion and when the book is launched, we're going to be talking about this, and we're going to be talking about it even after the launch, because there's so much information about this. There's a lot of theories, and there's a lot of information that both Mike and Ken have unearthed over the years. And we're so excited to have them on here. Mike and Ken, thank you for being on the podcast and joining us on this journey through your childhood, Ken, and all your research, Mike. So
before we get started, though, can you tell us the name of the book so everyone can look out for it when it's launched in May?
Sure. The name of the book is Alcatraz, The Last Escape.
Okay, great.
The name Last Escape, most people would assume that we're referring to Alcatraz, but it does have a little twist to it.
Yeah, there was an escape attempt after John and Clarence Anglin got out of the prison. It was some months later, so it wasn't technically the last Alcatraz escape, but like Ken said, it's discussing something else.
Got it. So let's start off. Ken, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, your unique family background, and your connection to the Anglin brothers, and just tell us a little about yourself.
Sure. So, as you said, my uncles are John and Clarence from my mother's side of the family. I first got introduced to the Alcatraz story when I was a year and a half old. I actually sat on my mom's lap as she watched the breaking news story of her two brothers as they were being plastered onto the screen, their wanted pictures. And I sat in her lap as we watched the story unfold on live TV. I physically never met John and Clarence. Now, I did meet the third brother. There's actually three brothers that were involved in the bank robbery that we'll eventually kind of get into. But I did actually meet him. before his death in prison also. So my mom comes from a large family of 14. John was number 6 in the lineup. Clarence was number 7, and my mother was number 10. So very large family. I have been experiencing Alcatraz all of my life. I probably didn't embrace it as much as I did starting in 2012. Growing up as a teenager, you pretty much try not to be someone who stands out in school. So I didn't really kind of talk about my past with my uncles until, like I said, in 2012, which we can talk about that in a few minutes.
Did you meet your uncles? Did you know them?
I never met John and Clarence. Like I said, I was born in 1961. They were already in Alcatraz at that time. Actually, Clarence showed up to Alcatraz from Leavenworth, where he had helped an escape plan with John, and he wound up showing up at Alcatraz just a few weeks before I was born. So did I physically meet them? No, but I knew all of the other family members, my aunts and uncles. And like I said, I did have the opportunity to be the last nephew to meet Alfred before his death in prison.
And your family, I mean, having something like this happen in your family, it's tragic, but it's also, like you said, you didn't want the attention. So was it difficult for your mom and your family to deal with this over the years? How did they work through that?
I would say the difficulty came from, at first, the FBI was very harsh on the family. Some of the stories that we can get into that I know happened. I know several FBI agents who came to our house as I grew up, questioning my mom over the number of years. And then eventually the U.S. Marshals took over, and we thought pretty much we had been left alone at that time. And we find out years later that we were actually being surveilled. So we were actually being followed, and our phones were actually being tapped. Some people say, well, that's just, you're just making that up. But we actually found out that actually happened. Yeah. And even today, they do keep tabs on some of us, which is pretty amazing. I mean, it's 60-something years, and the possibility of my uncle still being alive is very slim. They would be in their 90s, and none of the Anglin brothers ever lived to be that age. So, but it was hard on them, because every time we got together every year for our Anglin reunion, they were missed along with Alfred. And so it was a big hole in the family. But I think over the years, they've come not so much to learn to not talk about it as they now like to share it. So it's really something that we want to get out and tell the true story about what actually happened.
I think we were talking about what we wanted to talk about is dive into John and Clarence's childhood a little bit more. Start from the beginning. I know it came from a huge family, 14 children. I can't even imagine that. Just that mirror. I think of like the Octomom when she had all those 8 kids at once. I mean, I saw the pictures, and it's just amazing how that was kind of commonplace back then, especially for people who own farms, because they needed the help. But I don't think people realize how that can affect who you become later in life. So,
and the poverty level. I mean, I don't think people understand the poverty level that was going on back then. They don't understand that you had 14 kids and parents and maybe other relatives all living in like a two-room house. I mean,
that's I was thinking about that today because we were watching a segment on the news, and this individual was talking about how hard that they had it, not being able to provide for themselves, and just really I looked at my wife and I said, "Can you imagine this person explaining that to my grandfather when he was growing up, I mean, that's poor. This individual today doesn't even have a clue or even comes close to what poverty really looked like back in the 1940s and 30s. It was very devastating.
Very different. Yeah. And extraordinary to have all those children in that small confined space. And what can you do? They're just trying to get by. They're just trying to survive.
Just to feed them 3 times a day.
Right. You know, you almost sometimes wanted to ask my grandfather, you know, you didn't have a lot of money, and what in the world possessed you to have 14 children? But I think back then it was pretty common for large families to live together and help each other out. And that was really kind of the driving force that I believe that every one of my aunts and uncles, including my mom, when my mom was growing up, it was just known that she was going to work on the farm. And in fact, after she got married my father, they both worked as laborers on a farm. And I believe all of the children saw that as their future. You know, I don't think any of them ever saw, oh, I can become a doctor one day or a lawyer, or, you know, and I can get out of this lifestyle. And I believe every one of them, knowing that this was their destiny, is pretty much what kind of drove Alfred and John and Clarence to say, I don't want a part of this. You know, I see my mom struggling. I've seen her, you know, crying and taking care of 14 kids, barely able to get by. I'm, you know, going to school and clothes that my mom had to make out of a sackcloth, and taking baths on a porch in a wash tub in front of your other siblings. I just think that's what drove them to say, I'm not going to be like my dad. I'm not going to be a farmer, which is kind of ironic because later in life, they actually become farmers, you know. But at the time, they wanted what they saw other kids having in their school, because not every kid in their school was that poor, you know. So they were probably at the very bottom, and then they saw things in life, and like any other kid, you know, they wanted more than what they were getting. So.
Now, reading in the book about their early childhood and their experience in school, it was apparent that both of them, a lot of them, they got teased and they got bullied in school. And was that because they were poor?
Yes. I remember my mom telling me that when they lived in Donaldsonville, well, they actually lived in a little town called Iron City, which was between Donaldsonville, Georgia, and Colquitt, Georgia. They went to school in Donaldsonville, but even there they got bullied because of how poor they were. Moving to Ruskin, I believe they all thought, okay, we're going to have a fresh start. There are other farmers down here that's just like us. But my mom said they quickly learned that as soon as they got to school, and it wasn't just John and Clarence that got bullied. Every single one of them did. And John and Clarence and Alfred are just the ones that said they were not taking it anymore. And so they always wound up in fights, or, you know, they were the ones getting in trouble, but it was because they were being picked on. And eventually that just drove them to the point that they said, no more school for me, because they had a better time not going to school than they did going to school.
And they didn't really see a future with school. I mean, if they were just going to be farmers, what they need school for?
One of the things that we talked about in our previous episode was when they moved from Georgia to Florida, you know, they bought their the land. I think Ken said it was 9 acres altogether. They didn't have a house. It was just basically a piece of land the father bought, and he had a little bit of money to buy the land, and they actually lived in tents for quite a while, and there were a lot of trees on the property. So eventually he cuts down the trees and takes the lumber to a sawmill, and that was the materials that he used to actually build the house. He built the house himself with the help of his children and some others. So it was word probably got out pretty quickly when the family moved down to Ruskin that they had really no home. They were kind of homeless in a way, and they were living in tents. So I'm sure they were easy pickings for the other kids to make fun of because of that. That's how poor they were.
Right.
Wow.
You know, in a typical day, I remember my mom telling me this, a typical day in their life would be getting up early. They would eat breakfast. They had chores that they had to do before they went to school. Many times because of the chores, they would miss the bus and they would have to walk to school, which was about a mile. I used to always joke with her, you know, going uphill both ways in the snow, but they truly did walk to school. And then after they got back from school, every one of them had to go into the family farm field and help either whatever they were growing and picking. And then from there, they went and had what they used to call supper. Sometimes I call dinner. But from there, it was doing homework, taking a bath, going to bed. There were no TV at that time. There was no radio. There was no electricity in the house. And so it was pretty much going to bed, and then you start the whole cycle all over again. So their life was, to me, I would look at it as miserable. But my mom has a lot of fond memories of that time. To think about the escape, you really have to kind of think about that they had help. It wasn't a just get down to the bay, to the water line in the bay, and okay, what do we do next? So they had a plan and they had help. And we would find out later, as we started kind of doing some digging, that it was one of their childhood friends. You referenced him, Fred Breezy. We bring him early into the story because he plays a major role in the story. I didn't really kind of realize how close they were. I don't ever remember my family mentioning Fred Breezy at all, even though he went to school with a lot of the England family. He lived very close to them, and John and Clarence were very close to him. I don't ever remember hearing his name until I will have to say he was the patriarch of the England family after my grandfather died. And we bring him into the story because he's very instrumental in setting up the escape plan on the outside. And we'll talk about their older brother, Robert England, a little later. But he is the first time that I really kind of met Fred Breezy when he came to the England family gathering in 1992. And he told the story of him going down to Brazil, meeting with the brothers, taking the photographs that he eventually shared with the family. He gave a lot of detail about where they lived at and the farm. And so when we started kind of doing the book, I said, okay, there's got to be way more to Fred Breezy than what we've heard in the 1992 interview that was done. So as we started digging through historical records and newspapers, we started uncovering where not only was Fred Breezy friends with them when he was small, but he also got in trouble with them around the same time that they, like I said, they wound up in Mariana and a boys' industrial school. Fred Breezy was there at the exact same time. They just became, according to Fred, kind of painted it as, that they were childhood friends. And then he didn't run into them again until he met them in Brazil, which is kind of a crazy story to begin with. Mm-hmm. But as you started listening to the interview he gave to the England family in 92, he gave such detailed information about the escape that only someone either with the knowledge of physically being there when it happened, or he would have had access to the FBI files, which we know wasn't released until early 2000s. So he had no access to these files, and yet he was able to say and give information that is only in those files. So that really kind of, for me and Mike, I don't know about Mike, but it did for me. It really, to me, gave me hard evidence that he was participating in this escape. And then we go back into, of course, he was a drug dealer. He got into flying his airplane, taking drugs out of South America. And so as we started peeling the onion back, so to speak, and we started looking at early lives of Fred Breezy, we see where he not only helped them in the escape, but he's also the one who introduces them to Mickey Cohen.
Yeah.
Fred was early into the drug business. And
let me stop you right there, because I'd love to kind of ramp up in there, because there's a lot of cool information that leads up to that.
Okay.
And that how Fred Breezy, he went back. He lived in New Mexico for a little bit of time because his family had to move there because there was no jobs in Florida, and his father had to take a electrician job to work on a dam out there. And so they were out there for a little bit. He came back, and then he reconnected with those guys. And then he kept on getting in trouble with the brothers, and all these little things that they were doing, these heists and stealing stuff and everything. And so the father, according to the book, said that he wanted him to get his pilot's license. Maybe, hopefully that'll get him off the crime spree that he'd been doing and doesn't turn into a criminal. Ironically, that it did just the opposite. And so talk about the story. I love the story when he went back to visit a friend of his in New Mexico and how he got introduced into the drug trafficking world.
Okay. Well, so after, Mike, you can jump in with some of this too, because I know me and you both did this digging into the piece of this story. But we do know that Fred, when he came back with his family after being pulled from Ruskin, Florida, or the area that he was growing up in, all the way into just outside of Tucumcari, New Mexico, which I've been there before. Believe it or not, I have a relative that used to live there. Didn't even know that. And I've been there, and it's a very desolate place. Even when I went in, 1988. So I can imagine what it looked like back in the early 50s, late 40s. And so, we just know that once he got out there, he was not very happy, him or his sister. They eventually, after the project is completed, they moved back to the Ruskin, Tampa Bay area, where he connects back with John and Clarence. And from there, you can pretty much look at his rap sheet and you can compare it to John and Clarence's. They pretty much picked up where they left off. It was like they had never been separated. And one would get in trouble, the other wouldn't get in trouble. And it's kind of funny, you think about John and Clarence and going, well, they're coming from a poor family. They're doing this because they're trying to survive and they want a better life. But then you look at Fred Breezy and it's just the opposite. His family had money. They had, he didn't need to do this kind of stuff that he was doing, but yet I think it was the draw of the excitement. He was bored. And at some point in time, his father thought that him taking flying lessons would actually kind of calm him down a little bit, which you would kind of think that it would. It gave him another interest to doing other things. And from there, his father thought, okay, it would be a good time, since one of his friends that he met while he was out working on the dam invited him to come back out. They actually had stayed there, whereas Fred Breezy's family moved back. And so Fred drives out there. And, it's his kind of first time being back. He's off on his own, not with his mom and dad anymore. And this is where he gets introduced into the drug business. His friend who he had spent several years with there at the dam, started showing him, hey, I'm driving this brand new car that he was able to obtain. Fred couldn't understand how he got this. And he eventually introduced him into the business that he was dealing in. Well, lo and behold, he was actually working for Mickey Cohen at that time.
And what I thought was really interesting is how their connection with their childhood friend, Fred Breezy, was their gateway into like literally the crime underworld. And that got them to really think a little differently about what they were doing. But let's start off with John, because John seemed to fall in love with somebody, and someone that he knew from a very young age, and they were always very friendly to each other. But as they got older, they realized there was a big attraction there, how that led to, and like all the guys were starting to get involved with people, and how that kind of complicated their crime life. Because it was, what I found was really interesting is they, on paper, and the way you guys talk about them in the book, and the way, Ken, you talked about them, I mean, they still have very strong moral character because of the way they were raised by their mother. And, being able to raise 14 kids like that and keep everybody together and going to church. I mean, they were doing all these thefts and stuff, and they were still going to church with their parents. Every Sunday. They were good at home. They were good. They were just outside. They were mischievous, and they're trying to make money. They didn't like being poor. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Okay. So, gosh, as they got older, like I said, the life that they saw themselves coming up in, following their father's footstep, wasn't something that was attractive to them. I mean, they had already been harassed, bullied, teased in elementary school. It's one of the reasons why when they got into middle school, they pretty much said, okay, I've had enough of it. But, that lifestyle is really what kind of set them into where they wound up at. But it also, anytime that they met someone that accepted them as who they were, they became very loyal and good friends with them. Case in point, Fred Breezy. There were very few, to my knowledge, that they had. Now, one was, we touched a little bit about John's, the love of his life. In fact, one of his letters that he wrote from Alcatraz to his mom, he spoke about Helen, and he called her his queen. And he even stated, I would marry her in an instant if I had the opportunity. So Helen, at a young age, while they were in elementary school, was kind of like Fred Breezy, showed John some compassion, friendship, and John just fell head over heels with her. But like most people in that town, there were two sides of a railroad tracks. You were on the right side or the left side. And of course, they were on the left side. Helen and her family were on the right side, so to speak, And it was like a Romeo and Juliet. Her father did not want her having anything to do with the Anglin family, especially John. They were prone, even as young kids, to be in trouble. You see that as people read the book, you'll hear of stories of them getting into trouble during school. Some of it was their fault, some was not their fault. But still, it was a Romeo and Juliet type scenario. So, that pretty much, like I said, will set the stage for what people will read in the book about them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was really, it was sad that he was so, he's a young boy and he becomes friends with this girl. And then the father says, you're not allowed to talk to him anymore. And, she's young. She's like, what, 12 years old, 13 years old? I mean, what are you going to do? You have to listen to your dad. But it just seemed like it didn't matter. They were going to come back together no matter what, even after she got married.
Well,
So it's like one of
things
those
that's important
fated
to
things.
remember about her family is the family. They had money. They were in the upper socioeconomic class of the community, and of course, this is back in the 50s, and social class was very important. And when she was 16, dad bought her a car. Something that most people couldn't even dream of being so young and getting a new car from your father. And it was a status thing for the family. Like, look how much money we have. Look what we can give our children. And, then you have the Anglin family, the dirt poor farmers, and, the two of them, smitten with each other. The father's like, yeah, I'm not having it. No way are you going to be with him. He's trouble. He gets into trouble all the time. They have no money. You have better prospects waiting for you elsewhere. And, down the road, the father actually does sort of orchestrate a marriage for Helen with somebody else. But that's a little bit of a down the road story. And, Ken can fill in the gaps for that. But that's how much the father was involved in her life, of trying to keep her on the straight and narrow. And then, of course, as you indicated, oftentimes when the parents say, he's bad, you can't be with him, what does that do for a lot of young girls? They want to be with them. They want to do what they want to do. So,
yeah.
Well, and not only was there a restriction from Helen's side of the family for John, but there actually even became some upset parents, my grandparents, with the relationship that John was having with Helen, because, like you said, the Anglin family were very dedicated to going to church, and my mom tells, which we include in the book, is a very hilarious story. My grandfather always made everyone in the family go to church, and not only just Sunday morning, but it was Sunday evening and also Wednesday evening. But they were in church one evening, and my mom said that Helen came to the window of the church, knocked on it, and John saw her, and she motioned for him to come out. And Clarence is telling them, "You better sit still, because if Daddy sees you, you're in trouble." John takes off out of church, and him and Helen take off, and there's no telling where they went. But I think my grandparents sometimes saw Helen and her sister Ruth as almost kind of like a bad influence on John and Clarence, which is kind of ironic, because her parents felt the same way about John and Clarence. So.
Yeah, no, it was really interesting. And I think that whole time after they came back from California that first time, that's when it all for John, he realized he needed to make a move, and he felt like he was in the position where he was on the potential of making some really good money, and he could provide for her the way he feels like he could provide for his queen. Right. And so that was kind of the thing. And I love the story, how he used, and you can tell this story about how he used his niece to use as kind of like a go-between at the beach to kind of ambush Helen when she was there with her current husband, and because he had gotten word that things weren't going really well in Paradise in that marriage, and he felt like he had an opening, and he immediately, being the conniving guy he is and the planner, right, he says, I gotta weigh in, and I'm gonna go do it. Last week we kind of talked about the whole Mickey Cohen connection and how they were very hopeful about making some decent money, and they kind of overextended themselves, had some cash in their pocket, started spending money like drunken sailors, buying clothes and guitars and cars. And now and then they realized that they found out that Mickey started to get some heat from the Kennedys and that notorious clampdown of organized crime during that time in the 50s. So now they're at a point where they don't have the money that they thought they were going to be getting, and they had a taste of it. And then they had to go rob a bank. So they robbed the bank, and they were successful at it, but then they get caught. And then now we're at the point where they're facing not only charges from the state, but also federal. And I know you've talked about this, Ken, time and time again. He says this is really kind of defines what happens to them in the future, as far as, how they were charged and how they had the first trial. They had a public defender. But let's get into it. Tell us what happened, and just to kind of, one of the things you kind of talked about in last podcast is when they did rob the bank, they gave their brother Robert $500 cash and told him to hold on to it, put it in his shoe, and if for an emergency purposes. So that, as we were going to find out, that came into a pivotal point in kind of saving him. So let's start off what you guys know about the trial and the people involved.
Well, the one thing that really kind of struck me was
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
It's Wednesday, Addams. I see you're trying to distract yourself from your own banal thoughts. Let me help. Here's a recording thing made of my latest root canal.
Wednesday Season 2 is now playing only on Netflix.
Good night, itchy eyes. Good night, sudden sneeze. Good night to your symptoms of allergies. Xyzal is the allergy medicine you take before bed. It provides powerful relief while you rest your head. Not just all night, but all the next day. Xyzal keeps working, keeping allergies at bay. And without those annoying symptoms disturbing your rest, you can wake up the next morning feeling your absolute best. Remember, be wise all. Take Xyzal. At night.
Subtle results, still you, but with fewer lines. Botox Cosmetic, out of botulinum toxin A, is a prescription medicine used to temporarily make moderate to severe frown lines, crow's feet, and forehead lines look better in adults.
Effects of Botox Cosmetic may spread hours to weeks after injection, causing serious symptoms. Alert your doctor right away as difficulty swallowing, speaking, breathing, eye problems, or muscle weakness may be a sign of a life-threatening condition. Patients with these conditions before injection are at highest risk. Don't receive Botox Cosmetic if you have a skin infection. Side effects may include allergic reactions, injection site pain, headache, eyebrow and eyelid drooping, and eyelid swelling. Allergic reactions can include rash, welts, asthma symptoms, and dizziness. Tell your doctor about medical history, muscle or nerve conditions including ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, myasthenia gravis, or Lambert-Eaton syndrome, and medications, including botulinum toxins, as these may increase the risk of serious side effects. For full safety information, visit BotoxCosmetic.com or call 877-351-0300.
See for yourself at BotoxCosmetic.com.
The trial, I don't think they really believed at the very beginning that there was going to be multiple trials. What is amazing to me as I look at both sets of the trials is just how fast everything went through from start to finish. I even made a couple of notes about, so interesting, here's a little tidbit as we kind of set the stage. The bank robbery occurred on Friday the 17th, January the 17th, 1958. 6 days later, they're captured. So 6 days, this Thursday, January the 23rd, they're captured. 18 days later, they're in Alabama getting ready for the federal trial. Which is kind of crazy. And in itself, the trial itself, the federal trial, when you read the manuscript, it's like something you would think of out of an old, I'm trying to think of one of the trials in the old past that, it just seemed like everything went so fast for them that I think it caught them off guard. You could definitely read in the trial transcript that it was definitely something that they set up as far as like with their public defender. Okay, let's back up. So when they finally get to Alabama and they're getting ready for their federal trial, they had no idea that Alabama was going to come back and charge them again. You can see in the transcript that the public defender that was assigned to them, because they had no money, like Mike said, the the bond that was set for them might as well have been $1 million. I mean, they had no money to bond out. None of the family members had any money. The family couldn't afford to do, anything. And what's really kind of telling about that is their federal trial, there was not one family member there with them. They pretty much stood by themselves. And I think the way that it looked like it was playing out was that it was as you read it, the public defender who was friends with the judge,
that's often the case. That's often the case.
Right. In a small town like that, I'm sure they were, very good friends. I don't know how good friends, but according to, I think, what Mike found out, they were fishing buddies. But you can almost paint this picture in your mind. Yeah, the public defender goes to them and says, "Hey, you're going to do some time for this. Someone's going to jail." And so he said, I can almost see it. As you read the transcript, you can see it yourself. You go in, you plead guilty, you'll be sentenced, fairly light sentence. And, it really was a light sentence because if you go, I went out and did some research on, what's the average sentencing for a bank robbery back in 1958. And believe it or not, it was 20 years. And if you used a firearm and it was considered to be a deadly weapon, you could actually get up to 25 years. But so, you can see in the transcript as they're in the trial, and the judge to me is kind of funny because he reminds me of Matthew McConaughey, because he's always going, all right, now, all righty, now we're going to go to this, all righty, he had asked John his name, okay. And so you can tell he was probably from the old school, but it's just the fact that they would ask John something when he was asking John, do you want a speedy trial? Do you want to forego the grand jury? John at first answers no, because he didn't realize what he had said. And the judge actually calls the
public defender
to the bench and says, "Hey, didn't you discuss with them? Didn't you have this conversation with them?" And he goes, yes, but John just didn't understand what you asked. So he goes back and he has a conversation with all three of them. And then the judge asks him again. And John goes, yes, I agree to forego it. And they all three pled guilty, which is just amazing.
Well, I just want to intervene one thing here, just to kind of go back a little bit. When their defender talked to all three of them, he said, you can take a chance on a jury. And like Ken said, you can get a very heavy sentence of 20 years or more. I mean, they had the fake gun. That was a sort of a question mark of how they would treat that, the toy gun that they had. Would they treat it like a real gun? Because, of course, the people in the bank assumed it was real. It looked real-like to them. Or would they treat it as a non-lethal weapon? But it was still going to be 20 years if they were found guilty of a juror of their peers kind of a thing. Or the public defender said, if you plead guilty, I'll talk to the judge, and they were looking at maybe 5 or 6 years. He says we can get you down to 5 or 6 years, and then with good behavior, maybe you'll be out of jail in 3 or 4 years. So the brothers discussed it, and they said, you know what, we're liking the idea of a lighter sentence, so we'll plead guilty to the charges, because they were probably going to be found guilty anyway. I mean, they were identified by Helen's husband. He was the one that ratted them out to the FBI. They were caught with the money. So they really didn't have a defense as far as, saying it wasn't us, you got the wrong guys. They clearly got the right people. So they really didn't have anything to lose by pleading guilty. But then, of course, that would lead to other issues down the road. So that's when they're doing the trial and John says, no, we want to forego the speedy trial. Then the judge is confused. It's like, I thought they were going to plead guilty here. So what's going on? And that's, the lawyer corrects it. And then it kind of gets it back on track to what they had arranged with their public defender.
Yeah. And, to add into that, just to kind of paint the picture of how this was being set up. I mean, have you ever heard of, even today's time, that you would have a trial where you would be
you would be tried, convicted, and sentenced in the exact same day.
No.
That's unheard of. And so you could definitely tell either they were trying to speed this whole process up. They didn't want to take the time to go through the court system and let it play itself out, because, just as like Mike said, I mean, if the jury or the people that were part of the bank robbery, the defendants, if they had come in and ID'd them, but nobody was there. The only people that was in that courtroom from the transcript was the judge and the public defender. I'm not even sure there was a prosecutor there. There was a person that was taking the notes down, but there were very few people there, because the only people that's recorded in this document is the ones we just mentioned. So they clearly had been given this deal that they saw was going to be coming their way. And just like Mike said, if they had gone to prison, they would have done a few years, good time. They would have been out on parole. And, they knew they were going to go to prison. And I believe that's the reason why they pled guilty. And they said, let's go off. We'll be gone for a few years and then we'll be out. Probably nothing more than what they had done before in the past with state prisons. So, yeah, you can definitely see how this was an arranged trial, and it's just amazing how fast it went through. Because
I mean, it's crazy, because like, did they not have any other cases on their dockets for that time period? I mean, unless they pushed everything aside, it just seems it's miraculous how quickly they were able to get that through the system. But maybe I mean, it was a small town area. But it was a federal courthouse, correct?
Yeah, it was a federal courthouse. It was in Montgomery. So, I mean, that's at that time, of course, Montgomery's a lot bigger today, but at that time, Montgomery wasn't a really, really small town. I mean, it was large enough, like you said. It was a federal courthouse. So they should have been able to gotten at least more than one day's worth of trial out of this.
Well, and the reason it was a federal case was because they crossed state lines. They were in Alabama, where they perpetrated the crime, and then they drove back to Florida. So they crossed state lines, and that's what made it federal.
And I just wanted to kind of give a little recap. When we started we just got onto the Rock. John had just got on there, and I think Clarence would just got on there too. And they put him in. Believe you said they put him in separate cell blocks, but they quickly were able to get jobs in, what was it, the laundry room?
Actually, it was the cafeteria to begin with for John. Cafeteria. And eventually, Clarence would go in to being a barber. And then at some point in time, John would transfer over into the clothing room.
Got it. When I was going through the book again today, just before we started here, in the beginning of that chapter, there's a lot of letters from John back home, kind of explaining what it's like there. And it doesn't sound like he's talking about prison. He seems pretty happy. He seems pretty content. He talks about how the weather, he says, a little cold. He goes, the sea breeze reminds me of home. And he goes, everyone's pretty nice here. And actually the food is good. And I was looking through the regulations book, and it looked like they said that normal prisoners would only get about 2,100 calories a day. But the inmates at Alcatraz got 3,000 calories a day. And apparently it was considered some of the best food in the federal prison system. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what life was like there in comparison to the other prisons that they were, because obviously it was different, and it wasn't as bad as you would think it would be.
Yeah, that was the one thing that I picked up on John's and Clarence's letters that they wrote from Alcatraz. Was they did reminisce a lot about how it reminded them of home, the salty air, and I was even very shocked at one of Whitey Bulger's letters when he talked about being, he was in Leesburg Penitentiary at that time. And I guess it was just a horrible place to be. And he said at night he would reminisce about being back at Alcatraz. Like he really wanted to be back there. And I think a lot of prisoners look back on it compared to other prisons that they were in. And it was actually a very nice place to be. I mean, you had your own cell. Like you said, the food was awesome. Where else could you sit outside and look into the San Francisco Bay, look at the Golden Gate Bridge and look at downtown San Francisco? But at the same time, it was like a double-edged sword. I would think it, and according to Whitey and to some of the other prisoners, because you could look out and you could see freedom, and it was almost like it was able to touch it, but you couldn't quite grasp it. And you could hear the sounds and you could smell the smells of the hot dogs so at one point I would say it was probably one of the best prisons that John and Clarence ever went to. But then on the other hand, it just reminded them of the freedom that they didn't have.
Yeah. So Mike, let's talk a little bit about, because you guys go into some of the mechanics of what that place was like their daily schedule. And I don't think you have to go through everything, but I think it's important that people understand, it was, like all prisons, is very regimented. Their time is completely, monitored, and, they have to be certain places at certain times, literally right down to the last every like 20 minutes. So if you're going to give the listeners kind of an idea of what they would be, John and Clarence would be experiencing during a normal day at Alcatraz.
Their life was every waking moment was basically accounted for. They woke up at approximately 7 o'clock every morning or a little bit before. They were expected to keep their cells clean. They had a booklet, rules and regulations that was, I think, 50, 60 pages that laid out all the requirements that the inmates were expected to know forwards and backwards. So any infraction of the rules would usually deal with some kind of a punishment. They basically only had a few rights as inmates. They had a right to housing, of course. They had a right to food, and they had a right to medicine. Everything else after that had to be earned. If you wanted work privileges, you had to earn it. If you wanted to be a trustee, you had to earn it. If you wanted to go, they had movies there, you had to earn it. If you wanted access to the library, you had to earn it. And so they sort of dangled the privileges in front of them that if you behaved and, didn't cause any problems, then life became more pleasant as you went along. And so when they got up, they were expected to be clean shaven. They gave them razors, which would actually play a part in the escape, when they started formulating their plan, because that was a nice tool that they needed to create the false grills in the back of their cells. But, they got up, they had to, like I said, be clean shaven, clean cells. They did head counts, and then they had to stand in front of their cells and be counted and make sure, their shirts had to be buttoned up to the collars, and they had to be buttoned up with their sleeves, no rolling up of sleeves. And their clothes had to be clean. They had the laundry service, which we talked about that, John eventually landed at was laundry / clothing. So their clothes were clean. Then they went down to the kitchen area, and they had to be seated as, the guards would, everyone had to stand in front of their table until the guard said you can sit down. And then you sat down at your table. And then you waited in line for your food. You said, you can go back and get more if you wanted. That's one of the benefits of being at Alcatraz. And then you got up, you had to go back to your cell. Then they would count you again. And then if you had work duty, you'd go to work duty to, they had various shops that they could earn a little bit of money, or work around the prison for various jobs. Like Alan West had he was kind of a handyman kind of a person, so he can kind of roam about the prison fixing things. But when they would but when they would arrive at their workstation, they would be counted again. And then when the work was over, they would go back to their cell, they'd be counted again. I mean, it was just all day long, there were head counts. I believe there were 13 during the day. So approximately one for every waking hour, approximately 12 hours. And then in middle of the night, at midnight, they had a head count. At approximately 3 a.m, they had, they would, check to make sure everybody was in their cells. So they were constantly monitored. And then they also had metal detectors throughout the prison. Some were fixed at like the workshop areas, those were there all the time because of, the potential for inmates to smuggle out tools that can be used as weapons or digging instruments. And then they also had mobile metal detectors to just do random searches, just to see if inmates were carrying contraband. And the inmates used to call those snitch boxes. That was their little nickname for them. So everywhere they went, they were being watched by the guards. They were being counted by the guards. They were having to go through the metal detectors. So the basic message for the inmates was, don't even think about escape. Don't even try, because we're going to catch you. One way or another, we're going to catch you. Either one of the snitches in the prison is going to rat you out, or we're going to find it ourselves, either through carrying contraband or the head counts, which is about every hour. So even if you got away, we would be close behind you to track you down. So very, very regimented. The only real free time they had was on the weekends. They can go into the exercise yard. That was the very valued time where they just kind of roam around the yard, play basketball or baseball, or just hung out on the steps. And then also in the evening time from 5 to 9, after they had their last meal of the day, until 9 o'clock, which was lights out, they can be in their cells, writing, painting, practicing a musical instrument if they wanted. It was unstructured time. But other than that, all the other time was very well regimented.
Yeah. So the reason I had you go through that, because I want the listeners to understand how little time they had to kind of plan and make these things that they would need for the escape, whether it's the rafts and everything. And when they were doing it, they'd have to do it pretty damn quick and very stealthy, so no one would know. And the fact that they did it in a year and a half after they pretty much were in there is pretty a monumental task. So I just wanted to kind of get that out of the way. So what did you learn, Ken, from doing all this research about what it was like for them to kind of start planning this and all the obstacles that they would need to overcome to get to the eventual escape?
Well, like I said, I believe John, from one of his letters, he was planning this even prior to getting to Alcatraz, on the boat on the way out to Alcatraz. And kind of like Mike said, the regiment that they had to go through was pretty strict. And so they only had, you would think, a short period of time at night to do their planning. That once they decided, okay, this is how we're going to do it. But and maybe that's one of the reasons why, according to Wes, when he gave his testimony to the FBI, one of the first things they created was the heads. And that was because once they created those heads and the fake grills, that pretty much gave them all night long until, from the time the lights went out until 7 the next morning, they could pretty much be out of their cell the whole time.
I wanted to stop you right there, because you just kind of jarred a memory for me. I think when Clarence first went into his cell, that was the first thing he noticed, was that vent.
Yes.
So talk about that. Talk about what he noticed and what did he see?
Well, John and Clarence both noticed that when they reached down and looked at the vent, that they noticed that the concrete around it was starting to kind of flake off. And, like I said, when you're someone like John and Clarence, they're always thinking about what is the opportunity that is setting before me that no one really kind of notices. And Clarence notices the grill, and he notices how, wow, this concrete is not as strong as people probably thought it was. And as he kind of poked around at it, he noticed, and it wasn't the cell that he would eventually, be in when he started the digging with his brother John. But he noticed, okay, if one cell is like that, more than likely every single one of them is like this. No one's really kind of thought about going out the back of the cell. They always think of, during the daytime, I'm going to make a run for it, jump in the bay, or we're going to try to overtake some guards and force our way off the island. But I don't think anyone ever thought about going out of the back of their cell. And that was just the creativity that I believe that my uncles had. I mean, they might not have scored 136 on the IQ test, but they were very intelligent men.